Hello and welcome to week 5 of strategic management. This video will cover the content for week 5, which also corresponds to chapter 5 in your textbooks. We have a few objectives for week 5. First, we want to define competitors, competitive rivalry, competitive behavior, and competitive dynamics. Number 2, describe market commonality and resource similarity as the building blocks of a competitor analysis. Number 3, explain awareness, motivation, and ability as drivers of competitive behavior. 4, discuss factors affecting the likelihood a competitor will take competitive actions. 5, describe factors affecting the likelihood a competitor will respond to actions taken by its competitors. And 6, explain competitive dynamics in slow cycle, fast cycle, and standard cycle markets. The competitive landscape is characterized by increasing globalization, advanced technological development, and other factors that will lead to an environment that's more dynamic and charged with rivalry. Firms will act and react in a dance of sorts, but one involving very high stakes. Technically, even survival for some corporations, organizations. This chapter will introduce terms and concepts relevant to the conversation about competitive behavior in a variety of markets. Let's start with competitive rivalry. As we said, the competitive landscape is characterized by increasing globalization, advanced technological development, and other factors that lead to an environment that is dynamic and charged with rivalry, may even be, for some organizations, this environment will determine their very survival. Now, this slide shows us a model of competitive rivalry, and you'll see that there's the competitor analysis, then the drivers of competitive behavior, then we have the competitive rivalry and the outcomes, and then with feedback, it circles all the way back to competitor analysis. So this is an ongoing cycle. It is, in effect, a feedback loop, a competition that never actually stops or shouldn't stop. Because if you stop looking at your competition, it's very likely that they'll surpass you and you won't even know it. And you may lose market share, you may lose customers, you may lose your revenue and not even know why. A strategy's success is determined not only by the firm's initial competitive actions, but also by how well it anticipates competitor responses to them and how well the firm responds to its competitors' initial actions. And these actions are called attacks. The strategy's success is determined not only by the firm's initial competitive actions, but also by how well it anticipates competitors' responses to them and how well the firm responds to its competitors' initial actions. So, some important definitions. Firms operating in the same market with similar products targeting similar customers are competitors. Competitive rivalry is the ongoing set of competitive actions and competitive responses occurring between rivals as they compete against each other for an advantageous market position. Competitive behavior is the set of competitive actions and competitive responses the firm takes to build or defend its competitive advantage and to improve its market position. And firms competing against each other in several product or geographic markets are in multi-market competition. Now, all competitive behavior, that is the total set of actions and responses taken by all firms competing within the market, is called competitive dynamics. And firms must learn to compete differently if they are to achieve strategic competitiveness. To provide an idea of what this means, new ideas of competing may include bringing new goods and services to the market more quickly, the use of new technologies. An example of this could be Amazon, diversifying the product line. Barnes& and Noble diversified into music as a catalyst for growth. Shifting product emphasis. For example, U-Haul's focus on their accessory sales. Consolidation. An example of this could be the merger of Hewlett-Packard and Compaq. And combining online selling with physical stores, such as Sears' acquisition of Land's End. Expanding geographic scope contributes to the increasing intensity in competitive rivalry among firms. So firms trying to predict competitive rivalry should anticipate that they will meet a larger number of increasingly diverse competitors in the future. And competitive rivalry will affect their strategies more than in the past. Competitive rivalry exists when firms jockey with one another to pursue an advantageous market position. When one or more firms competing in an industry feels pressure to act or perceives an opportunity to improve their competitive position, competitive rivalry occurs as various firms initiate a series of actions and responses. And research findings show that intensified rivalry within industry results in decreased average profitability for firms competing in it and supports the importance of understanding these effects. If we view the model of competitive advantage, it leads us to a number of observations. The model shows that interfirm rivalry or competitive dynamics begins with competitive analysis in terms of market commonality and resource similarity. Market commonality and resource similarity affect the drivers of competitive behavior, firms' awareness, their motivation, and their ability to attack or respond. Attack and responses to attack result in competitive outcomes. Market position and financial performance are those outcomes. Feedback from competitive outcomes will affect future competitive dynamics. Competitive rivalry exists because of competitive asymmetry, which describes the facts that firms differ from one another in terms of their resources, their capabilities and competencies, and the opportunities and threats in their competitive environments and industries. It's important that firms see that competition results in mutual interdependence among firms in the industry, as each firm sees that competition results in their need to establish a sustainable competitive advantage. So they rely on each other to keep that competition going. And as firms strive to achieve strategic competitiveness and above average returns, they must recognize that strategic competitiveness and that their strategies are not deployed in isolation from rivals' actions and responses. The strategic management process represents firms taking a series of actions, fending off counteractions or responses, and developing responses of their own. So this brings us back to competitor analysis. The competitor analysis is the first step in predicting the extent and nature of rivalry with each competitor. So let's examine the appropriate features of this kind of analysis. First, we'll look at market commonality. Now, market commonality is the extent to which firms compete in the same market. And market commonality is increasing as more and more firms compete internationally. In a number of industries, some examples could be the airlines, chemical industry, pharmaceuticals, consumer foods. In these types of industry, the largest domestic firms compete in many of the same markets. So there is high market commonality. This means that each has awareness and motivation to respond to competitive interaction. Interestingly, high levels of commonality reduce the likelihood of competitive interaction. For firms that are in many common markets, there is generally competitive peace. However, when one of these firms makes a competitive move, the others are compelled to respond both rapidly and aggressively. Next is resource similarity. So resource similarity is the extent to which a firm's tangible and intangible resources are comparable to a competitor in terms of both type and amount. Firms with similar types and amounts of resources are likely to have similar strengths and weaknesses and to use similar strategies. So a little bit about resource similarity. In contrast to market commonality, assessing resource similarity can be difficult, especially when critical resources are intangible, such as brand name, knowledge, trust, capacity to innovate, rather than tangible, such as the access to raw materials or their ability to borrow capital. In most cases, dissimilar resources may increase the likelihood of an attack, whereas firms with similar resources or an overlap between their resource portfolios will be less likely to attack because similarity increases the likelihood of retaliation. Let's look at Coca-Cola and Pepsi for a minute. Their decision to target the fast-growing market for bottled water provides an example of how resource dissimilarity may cause potential competitors to be overlooked, especially by an industry's dominant firms. This means that competitive responses of firms such as Perrier Group to protect its key bottled water brands may be delayed due to the resource dissimilarity. So it can provide a competitive advantage. Next, we want to look at the drivers of competitive actions and responses. First, we have awareness. Awareness refers to whether or not the attacking or responding firm is aware of the competitive market characteristics, such as the market commonality and the resource similarity of potential attacker or respondent. When managers are not aware of these factors or assess them inaccurately, industry overcapacity or excessive competition can result. For example, this may be a partial explanation of the decline of Levi Strauss's core market, as the firm appeared to be unaware of changes in teenager interests as competition for their business intensified. Next, we have motivation, which is represented by the incentives that a firm has to either innovate and attack or to respond when attacked. Ability relates to each firm's resources and the flexibility they provide. Without available resources, such as financial capital and people, the firm lacks the ability to attack a competitor or respond to its actions. However, similar resources suggest similar abilities to attack and to respond. Finally, we have resource dissimilarity. And resource dissimilarity also influences competitive actions and responses between firms, and that the greater the resource imbalance, the acting firm and competitors or potential responders the greater will be the delay in the response by the firm with a resource disadvantage. So let's look at competitive rivalry a little more. Competitive rivalry is the ongoing set of competitive actions and responses occurring between competing firms for an advantageous market position. Because the ongoing competitive action response sequence between a firm and its competitor affects the performance of both firms, it's important for companies to be carefully study competitive rivalry to successfully use their strategies. So in other words, a competitive war between two firms that's not well thought out and well planned could end up destroying one or both firms. Now, in strategic and tactical actions, firms use both when forming their competitive actions and competitive responses in the course of engaging in competitive rivalry. A competitive action is a strategic or tactical action that's the firm takes to build or defend its competitive advantages or improve its market position. A competitive response is a strategic or tactical action the firm takes to counter the effects of a competitor's competitive action. A strategic action or a strategic response is a market-based move that involves a significant commitment of organizational resources and is difficult to both implement or reverse. A tactical action or tactical response. They're taken to fine-tune a strategy. It involves fewer resources and is relatively easy to implement and reverse. So the difference between a strategic action and a tactical action. Strategic action takes a good amount of resources. It's hard to implement, hard to reverse. A tactical action or response uses fewer resources, is easier to implement, easier to reverse. Hyundai Motor Company's expenditure on research and development and plant expansion to support the firm's desire to be one of the world's largest car makers by 2010, these were strategic actions. As we said, tactical actions are easily reversed. Pricing decisions are often taken by firms to increase demand in certain markets during certain periods, and that's easy to reverse. Now, what about the likelihood of attack? In addition to market commonality, resource similarity, and the drivers of awareness, motivation, and ability, other factors affect the likelihood of that a competitor will use strategic actions and tactical actions to attack its competitors. So we'll look at three of these factors: first mover incentives, organizational size, and quality. Now, first movers are the firms that take an initial competitive action, either strategic or tactical. First movers are firms that have the resources, capabilities, and core competencies that enable them to gain a competitive advantage through innovative and entrepreneurial competitive actions. By being early, the first mover hopes to earn above average returns until competitors respond effectively, gain customer loyalty, thus creating a barrier to entry by competitors, and gain market share that can be difficult for competitors to take in the future. So for a real world example, we can look at the success of Harley Davidson in large motorcycles or cruisers. In the 1980s, Harley-Davidson set the standard for low heavyweight motorcycles. And they've successfully defended that position by emphasizing both its reputation and its brand name. So the firm is trying to predict its rivals' competitive actions, might conclude that they will take aggressive strategic actions to gain first mover benefits. However, though a firm's competitors might be motivated to be first movers, they may lack the ability to do so. First movers tend to be aggressive and willing to experiment with innovation and take higher yet reasonable levels of risk. To be a first responder, be a first mover, rather, the firm must have readily available the resources to significantly invest in research and development, R&D, as well as to rapidly and successfully produce and market a stream of innovative products. Organizational slack is what makes it possible for firms to have the ability, as measured by available resources, to be first movers. Slack is the buffer or cushion provided by actual or obtainable resources that aren't currently in use. So slack is a liquid resource that a firm can quickly allocate to support the actions. So that would be R&D investments and aggressive marketing campaigns. And these lead to first mover benefits. But there are also dangers or disadvantages to being a first mover. It's difficult to accurately estimate the returns that will be earned from introducing product innovations. There's that unknown element. The first mover's cost to develop a product innovation can be substantial, reducing the slack available to support further innovation. Lack of product acceptance over the course of the competitor's innovations may indicate less willingness in the future to accept the risks of being a first mover. Second movers are firms that respond to a first mover's competitive action, typically through imitation. Doing so allows the second mover to avoid both the mistakes and the huge spending of the pioneers, of the first movers. They have time to develop processes and technologies that are more efficient than those used by the first mover. They're able to respond quickly to first movers' successful innovation-based entries, rapidly and meaningfully interpret market feedback to respond quickly yet successfully to the first mover's successful innovation. So the second mover has an advantage because they're not taking the risk, first of all, of the first mover action, which means they can benefit from both seeing what doesn't work and what does work or what is successful, and they can imitate that and build off of that. And an example of industry dynamics and how a second mover can succeed is provided by looking at the competitive dynamics of the athletic shoe industry. Now, New Balance is a second mover in the athletic shoe industry. It effectively competes against leaders Nike and Reebok by focusing on the needs of a well-defined market segment. New Balance products are not particularly innovative compared to industry leader Nike. New Balance is able to succeed by doing a better job of satisfying the needs of baby boomers whose ages are significantly higher than those of Reebok's and Nike's core customer groups, 42 compared to 25 and 33, respectively. New Balance also offers a new model every 17 weeks, compared to 6 weeks for most rivals. And their success seems to come not from rapid introductions of innovative new products, but by offering high-quality products at a moderate price and making them available in multiple widths, ranging from AA to quadruple E, recognizing that many people do not have average feet. Now, finally, we have late movers, and late movers are firms that respond to competitive actions, but only after considerable time has elapsed after the first mover's action, and the second mover's response. Typically, a late response is better than no response at all, although any success achieved from the late competitive response tends to be slow in coming and considerably less than that achieved by the first and the second movers. Since late movers are the last to respond to the first and the second movers' actions, late movers tend to be poor performers and are often weak competitors. For example, Avon was a late mover in e-commerce, and Dell was a late mover in providing internet access. An organization's size affects the likelihood that it will take competitive actions, as well as the types of actions it will take in their timing. Small firms are more likely to and quicker to launch competitive actions. So the smaller the firm, the more likely they are to launch competitive actions. Large firms are likely to initiate more competitive actions as well as strategic actions during a given time period. So the competitive actions a firm will likely encounter from larger competitors will be different than the competitive actions it will encounter from smaller competitors. Large organizations often have slack resources to launch a larger number of total competitive actions, and so they do. However, smaller firms have the flexibility needed to launch a greater variety of competitive actions. Walmart appears to be an example of a large firm that has the flexibility required to take many types of competitive actions. Analysts believe that Walmart's tactical actions are critical to its success and show a great deal of flexibility, such as quick advertising changes for back to school after, let's say, disappointing sales, which they did in 2007. So in other words, Walmart's competitive actions will be a combination of the tendencies shown by both small and large companies. Moving on to product quality. Product quality shapes the competitive dynamics in many industries. In fact, product quality is no longer a competitive issue, but a necessary or mandatory product attribute. If firms expect to successfully implement any of the generic business strategies discussed earlier in week 3, if you remember, those were low cost, differentiation, focus, or an integrated cost leadership differentiation strategy. Quality involves meeting or exceeding customer expectations in the products and or the services offered. Now, although quality is necessary, it is not a sufficient product attribute for firms to achieve strategic competitiveness. An acceptable level of quality merely provides firms with the opportunity to compete. An accepted level of quality in their products and services must continue to meet customer preferences. Quality is important in the service sector as it is in manufacturing. So quality is important both in services offered as well as products offered. For the importance of quality to permeate the entire organization and affect all of its processes and value creating activities, a dedication to quality must come from the organization's top level executives. Remember this, everything rises and falls with leadership. So if you have bad leadership at the top, not making the right decisions, not making the right choices, not setting the right example, not taking the right actions, both on a competitive level and as an example to those within the organization, bad leadership results in a bad company and bad performance down the line. Great leadership inspires people to great performance and create great products. So whatever initiatives the organization is pushing forward with, the commitment, the dedication, the quality, the competence must start at the top, or it's all going to fall flat on its face. Quality also affects competitive rivalry. The firm studying a competitor with poor quality products can predict that the competitor's costs are high and that its sales revenue will likely decline until the quality issues are resolved. The firm can predict that the competitor is unlikely to be aggressive in terms of taking competitive actions, given that its quality problems must be corrected in order to gain credibility with customers. Once corrected, the competitor will likely act by emphasizing additional dimensions of competition. So you can see that quality really is, although it may not be the thing that gives you competitive advantage, it is a core foundational element of any quality of any product or service that you offer that not only signals to your competitors what's going on inside your organization, but gives you the opportunities to compete on an equal level with others. Now, moving on, let's discuss the likelihood of response. Once a competitive action has been taken, its success generally is determined by the likelihood and the nature of the competitive response. In general, a firm is likely to respond to a customer's action when the action leads to a better use of the competitor's capabilities to gain or produce a stronger competitive advantages or an improvement in its market position. The action damages the firm's ability to use its capabilities to create or maintain an advantage, or the firm's market position becomes less defensible. So to predict how a competitor is likely to respond to competitive actions, firms should consider the market commonality and the resource similarity, the awareness, motivation, and ability of competitors, and the type of competitive action, reputation, and market dependence. Remember, a competitive action is significant. Rather, competitive actions are significant in competitive moves taken by a firm that are designated to gain a competitive advantage in the market, with the type of competitive action taken being classified based on the scope and the breadth and significance of the action. The likelihood of competitive response to an action depends on the types of action taken, strategic or tactical, and the potential effect on competitors. Because strategic actions require the use or dedication of specific organizational resources, are more difficult to implement successfully and more time-consuming and are difficult and often costly to reverse, it's more likely that tactical actions will be implemented and responded to more often. Because tactical actions require fewer organizational resources and are relatively easy to implement and reverse, their effects on the competitive situation are more immediately felt. Some examples of strategic actions could include Walmart's entry into the European market, Continental's decision to initiate flights into Lima, Peru, Bank One's implementation of an internet banking company. Remember that tactical actions are taken to fine-tune strategy. They involve fewer and more general organizational resources and are relatively easy to implement and reverse. Necessary organizational resources other than communicating new prices are relatively easy to implement and can be reversed. Tactical actions also are generally more quickly responded to by competitors than our strategic actions. Now, it can be instructive to compare the rapid response by airlines to competitors' tactical actions, such as fare reductions, for example. So American Airlines' acquisition of another airline company and its $1 billion purchase of gates at JFK Airport to respond to Continental's efforts to gain market share. Those were strategic actions. To predict the likelihood of a competitor's response to a current planned action, the firm studies the responses that the competitor has taken previously when they were attacked, and the past behavior is assumed to be a reasonable predictor of future behavior. Competitors are more likely to respond to either strategic or tactical actions taken by a market leader. So, for example, competitive actions taken by Home Depot are almost certain to incite a response from Lowe's. Now, here's an important psychological principle that can be applied here to our competitive strategy. Words are cheap. It's easy to communicate. It's easy to throw your words out there. It's easy to say, I stand for this, I stand for that. Easy for people as individuals. It's easy for organizations. But how do you know what is really, let's say, in the heart or in the strategy of an individual or an organization? You watch what they do, because people act out what they genuinely believe or what they genuinely value. So if a competitor says, for example, I just want to get along with everybody, I'm not into competition, but all their actions are highly competitive, then you have to assume that they're a very competitive organization and that perhaps their words are not, they're either not being honest with what their true underlying strategy is, or they're simply unaware of the disconnect between their actions and their words. This can apply for people, it can apply for organizations. So what are some likely effects of reputation on competitive actions, competitive strategy, responses? Well, first, actions initiated by firms with a previous history of success also will be more likely to result in quick reactions and imitation. Actions taken by firms with reputations for risk-taking and for initiating complex and unpredictable actions are less likely to be responded to. Or if you're seen as an industry leader and it's seen that the actions you take generally succeed, your actions will most likely be imitated. If you are an organization prone to take higher risks, and maybe sometimes they succeed and sometimes they don't, you're probably not going to be responded to as often. That can be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on where you are. Actions taken by price predators, they're firms that cut prices to capture market share and then raise them back up. They are seen as having a negative effect on competitors, and their actions receive very little response and very minimal imitation. Final note on market dependence. See, market dependence denotes the extent to which a firm's revenues or profits are derived from a particular market. Firms that are highly concentrated in or dependent on an industry or market in which a competitive action has been taken are more likely to respond than firms who do business in multiple industries and multiple markets. So, diversifying in an organization actually puts you in a much better position competitively. Whereas competitive rivalry concerns the ongoing actions and responses between a firm and its competitors for an advantageous market position, competitive dynamics concerns the ongoing actions and responses taking place among all firms competing within a market for advantageous positions. To explain competitive dynamics, it's important to understand the effects of varying rates of competitive speed in different markets, called slow cycle, fast cycle, and standard cycle. Competitive behaviors, as well as the reasons or logic for taking them, are similar within each market type, but differ across the market types. So competitive dynamics differ in slow cycle, fast cycle, and standard cycle markets. The sustainability of the firm's competitive advantages differs across these three market types. Slow cycle markets are those in which the firm's competitive advantages are shielded from imitation, often for long periods of time, and where imitation is costly. So competitive advantages are sustainable in slow cycle markets. Building a unique competitive advantage that is proprietary leads to competitive success in a slow cycle market. This type of advantage is difficult for competitors to understand. Copyrights, geography, patents, and ownership of information resources are examples of what leads to unique advantages. Once a proprietary advantage is developed, the firm's competitive behavior in a slow cycle market is oriented towards protecting, maintaining, and extending that advantage. So what are some examples of slow cycle markets? IBM's historical dominance of the mainframe computer industry, Boeing's dominant position in larger commercial jet aircraft, at least until the Airbus and the super jumbo jet hit the market. Microsoft's dominant position in the market for PC operating system software. Walmart's use of local market monopolies as it established its dominant position in discount retailing by setting up stores in small rural communities. Now, a firm operating in a slow cycle market may be able to retain its competitive advantage over time. Returns from the competitive action increase during the early launch years of the strategy. When returns level out, the firms can exploit their position and competitors counterattack or launch strategies that cause the first firm's basis for competitive advantage to erode. And as a result, if that happens, the returns are what we call competed away. Now let's take a look at fast cycle markets. Fast cycle markets are those in which the firm's competitive advantages aren't shielded from imitation, and where imitation happens quickly and somewhat inexpensively through reverse engineering and technological diffusion. Competitive advantages aren't sustainable in fast cycle markets. The technology often used by fast cycle competitors isn't proprietary, nor is it protected by patents, and as is the technology used by firms competing in slow cycle markets. For example, only a few hundred parts readily available on the open market are required to build a PC. Patents protect only a few of these parts, such as microprocessor chips. Fast cycle markets are more volatile than slow cycle markets. Prices fall quickly in these markets, so companies need to profit quickly from their product innovations, like rapid declines in the prices of microprocessor chips produced by Intel and Advanced Micro Devices, AMD, continuously reduces the prices to end users. Imitation of many fast cycle products is relatively easy, as demonstrated by Dell, Gateway, along with a host of local PC vendors. All of these firms have partly or largely imitated IBM's initial PC design to create their products. So what about standard cycle markets? Standard cycle markets is those in which the firm's competitive advantages are moderately shielded from imitation and where imitation is moderately costly. Competitive advantages are partially sustainable in standard cycle markets, but only when the firm is able to continuously upgrade the quality of its competitive advantage. The competitive actions or responses that form a standard cycle market's competitive dynamics finds firms seeking large market shares, trying to gain customer loyalty through brand names and carefully controlling their operations to consistently provide the same usage experience for customers without surprises. Because of large volumes, the size of mass markets, and the need to develop scale economies, the competition for market share is intense in standard cycle markets. Procter & Gamble and Unilever are direct competitors. They share multiple markets, have similar types and amounts of resources, and they follow similar strategies. For example, they both compete aggressively for market share in laundry detergents, where tiny fractions make a huge difference at the bottom line. Innovation has a substantial influence on competitive dynamics as it affects the actions and responses of all companies competing within a slow cycle, fast cycle, and standard cycle market. Right, so that concludes our content for chapter 5, week 5. If you have any questions, please let me know. And I will see you in class.